Now it's time for a poly panel with Senator James Paterson from Victoria and Labor MP Tim Watts. Thank you for your time.
Great to be with you.
Now,
Good morning.
big discussion today is about economic stimulus in the wake of longer-term bushfires, but also coronavirus is hitting our supply chains hard. James Paterson, we had the Prime Minister today saying that there would be some kind of stimulus. What form should that take, though?
Well, the Prime Minister said it'll be targeted, it'll be measured and it will be scalable. I think that's three really important elements. We don't want to go overboard here. We have to be proportionate to the problem that we face. What we have is a health crisis that is having some economic effects. This is not a financial crisis. It is not the same as the GFC. It's quite different to that. But the economy will need some support in this time. The first step has been the Reserve Bank cutting interest rates and the banks passing that on in full, which I know a lot of Australians will welcome. The second step, which will come in a few weeks' time, will be a package from the federal government.
Do you think the government's doing enough with stimulus in the wake of coronavirus?
Well, in order for a stimulus to be effective, we need to properly diagnose the cause. And the problems in the Australian economy predate the coronavirus and the bushfires. The interest rate cut we saw this week was the fourth we've seen in the last 10 months. We've seen investment rates from the business sector at the lowest they've been since 1990, before the bushfires or the coronavirus. We've seen 2 million Australians underemployed. We've seen weaknesses in spending, weaknesses in wages, in fact, record low wage growth. So to correctly have a stimulus that addresses the problems, we need to understand that these problems predate both the virus and the bushfires. What we would like to see is some real stimulus in the economy, bringing forward infrastructure spending, bringing forward the business investment tax allowance, looking at increasing the rate of New Start. There are a lot of things that the government could be doing to back in what the RBA is trying to do to get the economy going.
So the government's line is that there was $4.5 billion of infrastructure brought forward in the last May first statement, and that there's simply a capacity for projects that they can fund. Is that a realistic proposition to be saying that we should be funding more infrastructure?
Look, it's nonsense to say that the government is doing all that it can do on that side of the equation, and we know this because the RBA has been saying it repeatedly for months. This is not a new thing. The RBA is at record low interest rates at the moment. There's no more room for it to cut. You know, we're at the bottom of the barrel here, and they've been begging the Morrison government to come up with a plan, you know, to get involved, to get in on the act and start stimulating the economy. I mean, Josh Frydenberg, it's all very well for him to call the banks and say, back in the RBA, pass on those rate cuts. Well, when's Josh Frydenberg going to do his job and come up with a plan for the economy?
Senator Tim Watts does have a point in that we are almost at the bottom of where we can go with interest rate cuts. What is the government's plan?
Well, right now, already, the largest personal income tax since the time that Peter Costello was Treasurer are rolling out. That is already starting to hit people's bank accounts, and that will continue to be rolled out over the next few financial years.
And they're paying down their savings. They're not putting it in the economy.
Well, and consumers are entitled to...
debt, yeah.
Households are entitled to make those kind of decisions. If they want to do that, then that's their right. I don't want to judge them here from Canberra and say, no, you must go out and spend it. But if we make more money available to them, if we increase their take-home pay by cutting their taxes, then they can choose to spend it if they wish, and they can choose to save it or pay down debt if they wish as well.
But how does that stimulate the economy, though? Well,
they're going to have more money in their pocket, and inevitably at least some of that is going to be spent. As you rightly recognise, we've already brought forward infrastructure spending. We are running up against some capacity constraints. In Tim and my home state of Victoria, the state government says they're running out of concrete and so literally can't do any more major projects. Many of those projects are jointly funded by the federal government, and there's a lot more to come, for example, in Victoria, like the airport rail link, which are working very cooperatively with the state government on. So there's an enormous amount of things happening in infrastructure. There's tax cuts already happening. What the Prime Minister has indicated is likely to come forward in the next few weeks is some targeted assistance to industries that have been particularly affected by the coronavirus. And of course, there's been speculation in the media for some months now about investment allowances and other measures that, if not in this upcoming package, will certainly, I think, feature in the federal budget in May.
One of the interesting things that's been raised by the coronavirus is just how much we rely on China, with so many of our supply chains under pressure. There's this really interesting report from the Strategic Policy Institute today about Chinese treatment of Uyghur Muslims, about forced labour camps. Is this the time when it really brings into focus the fact that we can't grandstand with China because we rely on them economically, but at the same time there's serious concerns about human rights abuses?
I think there's a couple of really good points there, Annalise. Yes, you're right. We cannot be overly reliant on China. We have to diversify our interests. That's absolutely clear. What I was disturbed by this report from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, as you say, is the major global brands that have been caught up in what is effectively forced labour, if not slavery. We're talking about brands like Volkswagen, BMW, Huawei, Nike, really major consumer brands that should know better and should do better. And Australian consumers would be horrified to know that their consumer goods might have been made by people forced into that labour.
Tim Watts, do you think the government should be doing more on this?
Well, I mean, the ASPI report is deeply concerning, and it frankly confirms reports that we've been seeing in the media from leaked documents from Xinjiang about the treatment of the Uyghur minority and other Muslim minorities in China by the government there. We need to be clear with the Chinese government that these kinds of human rights abuses are not acceptable. I mean, that they're Australian values. We should be clear about that. We also need to understand that the Australia-China relationship is a broad, all-encompassing one. It crosses all spheres of Australian life today, and that's why Penny Wong's been calling for a briefing of all parliamentarians about the nature of this relationship so we can have a better informed, deeper debate about the way we engage with China. I want to back in what James said about consumer boycotts here, or maybe not, he didn't go that far, but about consumer responses to these issues. Often we focus on, well, what's the foreign policy? What's the policy of the Australian government towards China? I really think that we need to take a broader picture of this and say that as an Australian consumer, as a citizen, I can exercise my values in my purchasing decisions. And if forced labour is being used to create the products that I'm looking at on the shop shelf, I don't want to be buying that.
Were you actually calling for a boycott?
We've actually passed anti-slavery laws in the Parliament in a bipartisan way quite recently, which is attempts to crack down on this. It says to companies, you've got an obligation to do your due diligence on your own supply chains and make sure that you are not taking products from forced labour or slavery. Personally, as a consumer, I would be horrified to think anything that I bought would have been made in that way. I've got an Apple phone. That's one of the companies allegedly caught up in this. I'll be thinking very carefully about future purchases from companies like that if they're not able to come out and justify and explain that this is, in fact didn't occur and that's not the case.
If we can just jump back to the economic stimulus question and interest rates. Yesterday we saw all four banks for the first time pass on full interest rate cuts since 2015. That's reportedly because they were spooked about the bank levy being raised. The government's never really going to raise the bank levy, though, is it?
I'm not aware of any plans within the government to change the bank levy as it is. My understanding is that that is settled policy. I think the banks have made commercial decisions to pass on these rates, and I'm sure they're mindful of the important role they have in the Australian economy. And at a time of vulnerability, I think they do have to take that responsibility seriously.
Would you support raising the bank levy?
I'd support the government actually having a plan about what to deal with the problems in the economy at the moment. I mean, the real issue that we've got at the moment is we've got a marketing-based approach to this problem. We've got a salesman for a Prime Minister and we've got a press secretary for a Treasurer, and they're more concerned with the comms, they're more concerned with the sales job than they are with the substance. I mean, is a bank levy on Josh Frydenberg's agenda? I don't know. It doesn't seem like much in particular is on his agenda at all, given the legislative calendar at the moment. What we need is a coordinated, consistent plan from our economic leadership in this country, and we're just not seeing it from the Morrison government.
We are seeing a bit of a dearth of legislation here in Parliament. We're at the end of week 3 of the month, and not a lot's gone through.
Alice, I firmly believe that we should not measure the productivity of the Parliament by how many laws it passes. I think that would be a very, very bad idea. I'm much more interested in the quality of the laws that we pass, and we should only pass them when they're necessary, not just for the sake of it.
Have you passed any good quality laws while we've been here?
No, there's been quite a lot of legislation that passed through the Senate last week. It's obviously not sitting this week because we've got Senate estimates. But we passed a number of measures, for example, in the superannuation space to help reunite workers with lost superannuation, to help make sure that low balance accounts aren't being eroded by fees. They're really important changes that will make people's retirement more secure.
What do you think the government's sitting on that they could be pushing through?
Just to put it in perspective, I mean, James has sort of glossed over things there. Last week in the House of Reps, we passed a bill correcting punctuation errors in legislation.
Punctuation's very important in legislation.
Oxford commas, I'm sure, are very significant.
These things can go to the High Court if there's a typo, you know.
Given the significance of the challenges to the Australian economy and the anxiety in the Australian public from Australian workers, Australian families, about the economic challenges that the economy is facing, we need a bigger agenda. We'd love to see the government bringing forward the business investment tax incentives that we've been talking about for many, many months now. That'd be a very substantive legislative agenda, one that I'm sure James could even get behind, you know, lowering tax burdens. And it's something that Josh Frydenberg could have had ready to go. He could have been on the front foot about this. If they had an economic plan, they could have been acting already.
There's been some pretty serious overarching issues. We've had coronavirus. I mean, the National Security Committee's been meeting just about every day on this. We had the bushfire response again, really dominating spending approval and things like that. Surely that's going to impact how much legislation's going through.
We've had 7 years of economic policy drift under the Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison governments. 10 months of the RBA begging this government to get in the game. 10 months, 4 interest rate cuts. They've been MIA. Nothing.
Labor can choose to make this a partisan issue if they wish, but I suspect that most Australians watching this would think that at a time of crisis, when we've got a very serious health challenge, we should be working together to solve these problems. I think the leadership that the federal government has provided has been world class. We moved ahead of the World Health Organisation. We put in some of the swiftest, strongest restrictions on travel in the world, and the early evidence is that's helped delay the arrival of the coronavirus here on our shores, given us more opportunity to prepare so that when and if it does come, we're able to respond effectively and preserve the health and security of Australians as best we can. Labor's free to make partisan points if they wish, but I don't think that's what the Australian people will expect from it this time.